Okay, excellent. Thank you. All right. So these are the topics that we're going to be talking about tonight. We're going to start off with some weed control, and then we're going to talk about dividing perennials, tree and shrub planting, and composting. All great activities to get accomplished in the fall landscape, you know, from now until end of October. You know, we have a pretty long period of time in the fall to get some of these things done. So that's one of the great things about the fall season. So we're going to start off, first of all, we're going to start off with weed control. But before I get to that, I just wanted to mention, you can find this presentation at the link on this screen, go.unl.edu/fall-playbook. And you'll have the whole presentation. So if you want to save it, refer to it later, you have access to it there. You can also use the QR code on the screen. That will take you to the same place too. All right, so we're going to start off with weed control. And boy, there's lots of weeds out there right now. It's just incredible how fast they've been growing over the last, 4 or 6 weeks. It seems like when we're getting heat and getting some of those periodic rains, the weeds just really took off. I've been having a hard time in my landscape keeping up the way that I would like to. So we want to really talk about, okay, what types of weeds do we deal with in our landscapes, and which ones are going to be the most important ones to control, and which are less critical now at this fall time frame. So the summer annuals are the weeds that germinate every single year from seed. So these plants only live for 1 year, and then they germinate and they grow from seed and grow into a new plant next year. So the summer annuals includes crabgrass and foxtail and purslane, which is just out of control in lots of places, knotweed, spurge, and on and on. There's lots of summer annual weeds that we deal with on a regular basis in our landscapes. And these weeds, I'm going to stop real quick. Did somebody push record? Are we recording?
Yep, we are.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
And also just a reminder for folks to pop questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat, so we can keep track of them.
Okay. So these weeds are very evident in the landscape right now, giving people lots and lots of headaches. But the thing is, these weeds are going to die on their own in probably about 5 to 6 weeks. When we have our first frost, these weeds will die. So killing them now, first of all, is kind of a waste of time and money. And also it may only be marginally successful, because at this point in the season, these weeds are very mature. They have probably a thicker wax covering on the cuticle of the leaf blades. They're not going to take herbicides in as well as they would when they're young. So going after these weeds now is, I'm going to say, is low on the list of priorities, because they will be dying on their own shortly anyway. The one thing that you do want to keep in mind with the summer annuals is you don't want to let them go to seed. Crabgrass can produce a lot of seed. In flower beds and ornamental areas, if you happen to have amaranth, amaranth just has thousands and thousands of seeds on it. So it's really important with those particular weeds to either keep them mowed so that you're removing the seed heads and not letting the seeds mature, or pulling those weeds out and throwing them away so that you're getting the majority of those seeds out of your garden to reduce your weed pressure for next year. Okay, we're going to talk about pre-emergence here in just a minute, and using pre-emergent herbicides which kill weed seeds as they germinate is the best way to control this class of weeds. And so the first application for control of these next year will go on in May, and we'll look at that here a little bit more here in just a second. So the next class of weeds we want to talk about are the winter annuals. Now, these weeds differ from the summer annuals in that they germinate in the fall. And they grow into a small little plant which overwinters and then starts to grow again very early in the spring next year. So what you're looking here in this field is henbit. And henbit is a winter annual, very common. We see it a lot in farm fields. We also see it in a lot of landscapes. And so when soil temperatures are reaching the right, are cooling down and reaching the right temperature, which probably will happen around early September to mid-September, these winter annuals will start to germinate. So if you have a lot of problems with these specific weeds, like annual bluegrass or downy brome or chickweed or henbit, then putting a pre-emergent down in the fall to kill those seeds as they germinate is one of the best ways to control them. Now, if you don't want to use herbicides with these weeds, then you can hoe them. You can just hoe them out, look for the tiny little plants as they start to develop here in the next 3 or 4 weeks, and hoe them out. That would be a great mechanical method of control. Now there is kind of some debate, I'll say, about henbit specifically, because henbit, you can see in the picture, obviously, it has lots and lots of flowers. And these flowers do serve as a good food source for our early emerging pollinators, like the mated queens that are the ones that overwinter and when they first emerge in the spring are looking for food sources which are scarcer at that time of year. So there is debate about the value of allowing henbit to grow, but that's an individual decision, that we leave up to you as the landscape manager, whether you want to allow some henbit to develop in some areas of your landscape, or if you want to go ahead and control it. But these are all the winter annual weeds, and these will be best controlled with pre-emergent applications or with some manual control here in the next few weeks. Now, the one additional class of weeds that this is a great time of year to go after this particular group of weeds, and these are obviously the perennials. So weeds that live where the actual individual plant lives for multiple years. And one great example of that is dandelions. Dandelion plants themselves are perennial, and they will come back year after year if you don't kill them. Other examples of perennials are ground ivy and wild violets and yellow nutsedge and nimblewill. So all of these are perennial weeds. Perennial weeds, as the nights start to get cooler and the days are getting shorter, these weeds will start preparing for winter, meaning they'll start to pull carbohydrates out of the leaves down into the crown and the root system, so that they have those carbohydrates in storage. And this is a process that they do as they prepare for winter every year. So for that reason, fall is a really great time of year to go after these weeds, because as they're pulling the carbohydrates down into their crowns and root systems, they also pull in herbicides very well at that time. So if you spray a broadleaf herbicide on this dandelion, anytime from mid-September into late October, it's going to pull that herbicide in really well, and you'll get your best level of control on perennials with fall applications. So I always cringe a little bit when people are asking questions about, controlling ground ivy in the middle of the summer or dandelions in the middle of the summer, because you have much less efficiency as far as your kill rate on these weeds when you go after them at that time. But when you do it in the fall, you're going to have a much better success rate. Okay? And the only thing to keep in mind with fall applications is that the plants have to have green foliage so that they can take in the herbicide. And typically we want air temperatures to be about 45 degrees or above. So anything below that, and the plant becomes so dormant and inactive that it may not pull the herbicide in. So as long as you have those two conditions in place, you're okay to go ahead and do perennial weed control here in the fall. All right, so let's go back and talk a little bit more about pre-emergent timing. It's specific if you ended up with a lot of annual weeds this year in your landscape, and I think at least in a lot of areas, a lot of landscapes that I see on a regular basis, There were more weeds this year than in years past. And I think in lawn situations, that may have been true because there may have been some thinning in some of those lawns due to drought damage in the lawn that has occurred over the last couple of years. And so any place that there was thinning of that turf, in a lot of instances, the weeds took over and the weeds filled in where the turf had thinned. So you may have areas of spurge or purslane or additional larger than normal amounts of crabgrass or foxtail in your yard. Now, if that was the case, and if the thinning in your lawn was pretty extensive, then we hope that you'll be doing some overseeding this fall. And that's what John talked about last week. If you want to go back and review the presentation that John made last week about fall lawn care, you know, we have until about 15th of September in eastern Nebraska to overseed and get those thin areas of the lawns filled back in again. And honestly, filling the lawn in and getting a nice thick turf in place is really one of the very best ways to provide long-term weed control. So we would really encourage you to do that. But as you're working on overseeding, fall weed control becomes a little more problematic because you have to, there are only certain products that you can use in your lawn for weed control if you're going to be doing an overseeding, okay? But again, thinking about next year to try to prevent the weeds from being such an issue next year, remember that you need to make at least 2 applications of a pre-emergent. And, you know, most of the pre-emergents that we use in lawns, and I have a list of them for you here in just a minute, most of them will have a residual of about 8 weeks, 8 to 10 weeks. There's one, prodiamine, which has a longer residual. But with an 8 to 10 week residual, you're going to be making 2 applications of the pre-emergent to get you through the largest part of the summer without having a lot of weed breakthrough. So your first application for crabgrass pre-emergent goes on usually the first week in May. That coincides with our springtime weather and our soil temperatures reaching about 55 degrees for 2 or more consecutive days, which is the condition that you need for crabgrass seed germination in the soil. So that first application goes on about the first week in May, and then the second application would go on about 8 weeks later, which would be about the first week in July. And oftentimes we find that people miss that second application, and if you miss it, your herbicide is breaking down and it's gone by early July. Then from July on, all of those weed seeds that are still there in the soil have the opportunity to germinate and grow. And that's what results in us having a lot of weed breakthrough in the later part of the year. Okay. So I wanted to just show you some of the different pre-emergents that we have available for use in landscapes. And the first one, Barricade, or prodiamine is the chemical name. This is the herbicide that has the longest length of residual. It can have up to a 16-week residual in some product formulations, but it's going to be really important with whatever product you buy to read the label and see what is recommended as far as when to make your second application. Because, you know, products can be formulated in different ways. So be sure to read that label. And usually on the turf bag, it's going to say Barricade as the common name for this chemical. So you can look for that. 2 really common pre-emergents that we see in a lot of lawn care products are dithiopyr and pendimethalin. Dithiopyr goes under the common name of Dimension. Pendimethalin is usually called Pendulum. So those are also two very common products. And both of these have that 8-week residual period primarily. Now, I've listed a few other pre-emergents here as well. And a couple of them are really more commercial products and not really something that most homeowners would buy. And that would be the Pennant and the Snapshot. But the next 2, Surflan and Treflan, are products that are not as common, but we still find them occasionally, specifically for use in ornamental landscape beds. Surfland usually is available as a liquid, and Treflan could be a granular or another formulation. But I just wanted you to see the various pre-emergents that are out there on the market. And I also wanted you to note that each one of these has guidelines that you need to follow. So, you know, like for example, dithiopyr, you know, you don't want to incorporate that. You want to leave it right on the surface of the soil. With others, like the pendimethalin, you're going to get your better control, your better effectiveness if you apply that under mulch. So be sure to read the labels and follow the label directions as closely as possible so that you have good, efficient control with these products. Okay. Now, if you are going to be doing some overseeding, as John talked about last week, there is one pre-emergent herbicide that you can use. Well, actually, there's two, but the most common one that we see anymore is this Scott's Turf Builder built for seeding, which contains the chemical mesotrione. And mesotrione will be effective at killing a lot of those annual weed seeds, but it won't affect the grass seed. So it won't kill your grass seed as it germinates. So if you really feel like you need weed control as you're doing a fall seeding, we would encourage you to look for this Scott's Built for Seeding product. Now, the other strategy, if this product is not available, would be to just bite the bullet and ignore the weeds. Okay, remember, those annual weeds are going to be dying shortly on their own anyway. And if you can get your grass seed up and going and just keep mowing it so that the weeds don't get taller than the grass, and so the grass can, you know, photosynthesize and grow as vigorously as possible, those weeds will die off naturally. Then you can come back with a pre-emergent in the spring if you still need it, and follow that schedule that we just talked about a minute ago. Okay. An older product that we used to use a lot for weed control in new seedings was Tuppersan or Sigeron, but we don't see that in the market as much anymore. We're seeing a lot more of the mesotrione, and it's a little more effective product. So that's the one that would be the best at weed control if you're doing a new seeding. Okay, so everything we talked about with the pre-emergence has to do with those annual weeds and also preventing additional perennial weeds from germinating from seed. But typically the perennial weeds don't usually germinate in the fall. They usually germinate more in the spring and throughout the summer. So that brings us to post-emergent weed control. And that brings us back to that whole class of the perennial weeds and getting you that good, effective control here in the fall timeframe. So you can go after these weeds with contact or systemic herbicides, but really in the fall, your better option is going to be to use a systemic product so that chemical will move down into the root system and you'll get a good kill on the roots and the crown and the entire plant. Now with the weed in this picture with these wild violets and a lot of other weeds actually have a fairly waxy leaf surface. And when you spray a liquid product on this leaf, oftentimes it'll just run off because of that waxy leaf surface. So for that reason, we often recommend using what's called a spreader sticker. Now, the spreader portion of that product decreases the surface tension of water so that the droplets will sheet over the leaf surface better. And the sticker portion of it holds the chemical or holds the liquid onto the leaf so that it doesn't run off. And so this makes your application more effective because that herbicide is held on the leaf so that it can be taken in by the leaf tissues and translocated down to the crown and the roots the way we want it to. There's a common spreader sticker that I've seen in garden centers and box stores and nurseries called Turbo Spreader Sticker. It's a very common product. You're just going to follow the label directions and use a small amount of this product and mix it in your tank as you're mixing up the herbicide that you're going to be using. and it will help give you better control. So with the post-emergent perennial weed control here, we're usually talking about spot sprays, unless you just have a really serious infestation. But usually you're going to get better control with a liquid spot spray application than you will with a granular. Now, I kind of say that a little tongue in cheek, and because the formulations of herbicide of lawn care products with post-emergent broadleaf weed control components to them have gotten better and better, so that they do provide a pretty high level of control. But again, if you only have a few weeds in your landscape, then it really would be better to just do a spot spray on these types of weeds. So here are some of the chemicals that we would typically use to control some of these perennial broadleaf weeds. And a lot of times you're going to see these products or these chemicals not as a standalone chemical, as the only chemical in the product, but you'll often see them blended together. And I think I have some examples here on my next slide. But common products would be 2,4-D and dicamba, which have been around on the market for a long time. A newer product that we're seeing in a lot of homeowner products is carfentrazone, which also goes after and kills broadleaf weeds. Then another newer one is quinclorac, which controls broadleaf weeds and some grasses. The product that I find works well on ground ivy and wild violets is triclopyr. And you'll find that in products labeled as clover killers or brush killers or poison ivy killers. So that's a very good product. Then we've got sulfentrazone, which is effective against broadleaf weeds and some sedges, like the yellow nutsedge we're going to talk about in a minute. And then fluazepop, which is great at killing grassy weeds. So if you've gotten some tall fescue or some Kentucky bluegrass, both of which are perennials, which have crept into your ornamental beds or your flower beds, then fluazepop would be a good systemic way to go after and kill that grass and keep it out of your beds.
Sarah, can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
One of the questions was bindweed in the lawn. Of these broadleaf killers, do you find that one is more effective than another? Is trichlorpyr pretty good on bindweed? That's such a tough weed.
Yeah, bindweed is a tough weed. I would recommend the trichlorpyr. I think that would be a good product to try. But then also with that weed again, use the spreader sticker, because bindweed does have a leaf that can shed the herbicide pretty easily. So use the trichlorpyr with the spreader sticker and get good coverage on those weeds, and hopefully that'll give you some good control.
And this would be in the lawn, because the individual also asked about controlling it in an ornamental bed. So I just want to make sure you realize we are talking about the lawn here.
Yes, and trichlorpyr is a selective product which only kills broadleaf weeds, so it shouldn't do any damage to the lawn. Follow good application techniques, which we always recommend. Never spray any product on landscapes or lawns which are drought stressed, or anytime air temperature is above 85. If you do those two things, you could cause some damage even with a broadleaf weed control product like trichlorpyr, which is not meant to damage grasses. Otherwise, it's completely safe in a lawn. Trichlorpyr could also be used in an ornamental bed. You would just have to be very careful with your spot sprays to make sure that you keep it off of the ornamentals that are desirable, that you want to save. If you need to, you can pull the bindweed down out of the plant onto a bare area of mulch or soil and spray it on the ground. And that way you'll have some leaf surface that can take in the chemical and go down and kill that root. Okay, so here are just wanted to give you some examples of some common products that are out there right now, and give you a look at some of the combinations that you might commonly find in these products. So, quite often we see 2,4-D, dicamba, and MCPP mixed together. You may see quinclorac in there with 2,4-D or dicamba, and so on. So, lots of different combinations. Now, I did want to point your attention to the last one in this table, which is bonide or Earl May's sedge ender. So sedge ender has sulfentrazone and prodiamine. Now, prodiamine is a pre-emergent. It's that long-term pre-emergent we talked about early on. Sulfentrazone is a herbicide which will kill sedges like yellow nut sedge. So this combination together is meant to kill existing weeds and then provide some pre-emergent control for all of those little tubers, those little yellow nut sedge tubers which are in the soil, which will germinate and start to grow when we kill the parent plant. So this is a nice combination to give you, quick or a kill on the existing plant, and then also provide you some pre-emergent for those tubers. Okay. And then, of course, we do have some non-selective herbicides that we can use too. And, these might be used, again, in a mulch bed where you can spray plants that are just in the mulch, or they might be used on sidewalks or driveway cracks or places like that where you might have some weeds emerging. Of these products, Roundup is a systemic, so that one will move down into the root system and kill the whole plant. Others are just contacts and only kill the leaves. In the fall, I don't think you're going to get as effective a control of the weed overall with a contact application in the fall, unless you have time to go after it and kill the foliage back, let it grow back again, kill it again, and go through that process a couple of times. If you have the time to do that, you might weaken the plants enough that they will die over the winter. But otherwise, with fall applications, I think you're really going to have better effectiveness with a systemic type herbicide. Okay, so I just wanted to throw in a couple of specifics about yellow nut sedge, because that can be such a bear in landscapes, and controlling it is kind of a long-term project. So here are the products that are recommended for use or for control of yellow nut sedge. We've got sedge hammer, which contains halosulfuron. We've got the sulfentrazone, which is a systemic, and it does have some pre-emergent effect on the tubers. Then we've got the older chemistries, the Basagran, the MSMA, DSMA. We still find some of these older products available in garden centers, but they're not quite as effective as the halosulfuron or the sulfentrazone. So we are past the longest day of the year, which we always talk about a lot when we talk about yellow nut sedge. But that doesn't mean that you can't kill the existing plants that are there right now. So if you kill those plants and prevent them from coming back next year, that doesn't mean the problem is solved, because you'll have lots of the little tubers on the root system of these parent plants, which will start to germinate and grow next spring. So if you have some areas in your landscape where you have a lot of nut sedge you're really battling with, you might want to mark them. So like maybe put some flags out in the fall when you know where the plants are, and then maybe early to mid-June next year, before the longest day of the year, apply a pre-emergent product like prodiamine or like sulfentrazone, and that will help to kill some of those tubers as they start to germinate. And then if we go through the rest of the summer, if any plants that escape and do emerge, you can go after those, with the sedge hammer and kill them. Okay. That's all I had on weeds. And so I'll stop here for a second and see if there's any questions that I need to answer, or if you guys have already answered all the weed questions.
I think we've gotten the majority of them answered. John's in the process of answering one right now.
Okay, very good. Well, then we'll just keep moving on and talk about dividing perennials, because fall is a great time to divide perennials too. We have a pretty long period of growing season. If you start dividing perennials in early to mid-September, after we've gotten past the hottest part of the high temperatures in August, then we almost have 2 months of growing period for those plants to develop roots and become established on the site before they have to go into winter. And so that makes fall a great time to divide perennials. Now, if you're going to divide perennials in the springtime, which is another great time to divide them, then you would want to look for the period when the plants are just growing. As these plants are, as you see here in the pictures, these are just getting started, and these would be in an ideal growth stage for you to go ahead and dig them up and divide them. Now, with dividing of plants in the fall, you may actually have to cut the top growth down. For example, tall sedum or showy sedum, which gets to be about 1 foot to 18 inches tall. If you wanted to divide that, you might want to cut the stems back about halfway, or maybe to about 6 to 8 inches, then dig the crowns up, divide them, and move them to the new locations. But so when do we divide? Well, if you have a plant like this catmint, which has developed kind of a dead center, this might be a good time to dig this plant up and maybe rearrange it in the landscape bed so that you don't have this big dead area in the center. If the plants are becoming stunted, or if you're not getting as many flowers anymore, those would also be good indications that it would be time to divide those plants. Now, there are those some perennials which really don't tolerate division very well, and I've listed them for you here. So, you know, if you're a brave gardener and you want to try it, you can. I would say take as big of a root system as you can and try not to divide them down into small little pieces, but divide them into pretty large sections. But overall, the perennials I have listed for you here don't need division very frequently, if at all. So the plants that we're dividing in the fall are usually plants that have bloomed early in the summer. So the spring and the early summer bloomers, we divide them in the fall. The midsummer and fall bloomers, typically we're going to divide those in the spring. Now, going back to my example with the showy garden sedum, that's a fall bloomer. If for some reason you really needed to move it or divide it in the fall, you could. You're probably going to disrupt its blooming cycle, and you may not get as showy of flowers in the fall, but you won't kill it. It's just that you won't get as many flowers. So here you see in the picture, ideally, as we're digging up this ornamental grass, it's really best if you can dig up the whole plant, and then either with a garden knife or with a sharp spade, you can cut that crown into pieces or into sections that you're going to move. You can, if you'd like, take pieces off the side of a perennial clump. It's possible to do that too, but in many cases, it's better to dig the whole plant up and then just divide it. Ideally, you want to choose a day that's cooler, maybe a little cloudy, so that at least for the day, the plants they don't have a high stress situation that they're trying to survive as you're going through this dividing process. And then, of course, you're gonna find a new site that's well matched to the requirements of the perennial that you're dividing. You're gonna dig a nice hole and loosen the soil and get that plant replanted as soon as possible and get it watered back into the new location. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about tree planting too, because fall is an excellent time for planting trees. In fact, it really is even better than spring because we have that long period of root growth potential in the fall. And then we have another period in the spring of usually 2 or 3 months maybe. So altogether we have maybe 5 to 6 months of potential root growth period before the tree has to go through hot weather in July and August. So fall is really an excellent time to plant woody plants. But I think what I wanted to focus on tonight is making sure that we address some of these production issues that we run into with woody plants, especially trees, to make sure that we get our trees off to a good start. And so the picture that you see on the left, you can see we've got some roots that are circling, and eventually, as that trunk gets bigger and bigger, eventually those roots will start to girdle that trunk. This is a problem that originates from the very earliest stages of propagation with plants like this tree, when they may have been grown in a small pot or a small production pack. And as those roots hit the side of a slick plastic container, they started to grow in a circle. So it's really important that you investigate the roots of the plants that you're buying and look for things like these circling roots. And ideally, you would want to tease them out so that you could straighten them out and kind of make them grow out in a nice flat plane. If you can't do that, then you may have to cut them or remove them so that they won't just continue to grow in a circle like this. Sometimes when we buy plants in containers, you take the plant out of the container and find that you have an entire mass of roots that have grown all the way around the inside of the container. Some of the newer research on trees and tree planting has shown that if you use a process called squaring off the ball, it works well to help eliminate these circling roots and get the tree off to a good start. So what you do is you take that circular root mass and with a sharp saw or a knife, you cut off a small amount of growth on each side, like maybe an inch or half an inch, just enough to take out those roots on the outside of the ball. And you do that on the other side too. And then you turn it and you do it on the remaining two sides. So basically you've taken a circular root system and you've made it into a square root system. And in the process, you have removed the majority of those circling roots that would have eventually become a problem in years to come. So circling roots are an important thing to keep in mind. Also planting depth. And when you look at the picture here on the right, what I want you to see is that the base of the trunk and the root flare where the trunk is starting to differentiate into the root system, that should be right at the soil surface. You should be able to see that after the tree is planted. If that root flare is buried and the sides of the trunk go straight down like the sides of a telephone pole, then that tree is too deep in the soil. And that is going to be a lifelong problem for that tree for the rest of the time that it's alive. Trees that are planted too deeply don't have as much oxygen in those lower layers of the soil that they need for good root growth. And so trees that are planted too deeply never develop as good of a root system as a tree that's planted correctly. So it's really important to make sure that you get this planting depth right. Now, if you're buying a tree in a container, what you may have to do is tease away some of the soil at the top of the root ball until you can find the root flare. And then once you find it, make sure that you plant that right at the soil surface, okay? So we would say dig the hole 2 to 3 times wider than the existing root ball that you're dealing with, but slightly shallower than the depth of the root system, because we don't want to loosen the soil beneath the root ball and then have that tree sink and end up being deeper down in the soil than we wanted it to be. But loosening the soil, even if you're dealing with a heavy clay, just physically loosening the soil can make it a lot easier for those new roots to get out into the native soil and become established. Okay. So just to show you a couple more pictures of trees that are suffering from problems that should have been addressed at planting. And this is all the same tree, these 3 pictures. So you can see what the crown of this tree is looking like. We're having some severe leaf scorching on one side of the tree. And directly below that, you can see where we have several roots that are starting to girdle and compress the trunk on that side of the tree. And so as those roots compress that bark, they're preventing water movement from going up that side of the tree, which is translating into the leaf scorch that we're seeing up above. So, you know, at this point in this tree's life, there isn't a whole lot you can do about this, but this is something you definitely want to address at planting and make sure that you eliminate these roots. Okay. And then once you get the tree in the ground, it's important to make sure that it stays well watered so that you can get it off to a good start. So deep, infrequent watering is what promotes the best root health, even for a brand new tree. Now, so here in this picture, we have an older mature tree and we have a very young tree. And one thing I want to point out to you here, if you look at the base of the trunk of the older tree, on both sides, we can see that we have a nice root flare on that tree. So that tree was planted correctly, planted at the right depth. Now the young tree is a little too far away, so we can't really see that very well in this picture. But hopefully there's a good root flare there at the base of that trunk. So with trees, when we're doing our irrigation, we want to focus on moistening the top 8 to 12, or for a mature tree, 18 inches of the soil, because that's where the majority of the water absorbing roots are going to be. So you might soak the tree down really deeply and try to get the water down to that 8 to 12 inch depth. And then you may not have to water again for maybe a week or maybe even 2 weeks, depending on what air temperatures are. If it's hot outside and we're 90+ degree day temperatures, then you may need to water once a week. If it's down in the low 80s, 70s, you may be able to, just water every couple of weeks. But what we would encourage you to do is to check the moisture of the soil. And you can either do that with a soil probe, like a long bladed screwdriver, or you can just dig down into the root ball of that new tree and feel the soil with your hands. Does it feel wet? Does it feel dry? And then if it starts to feel dry, then go ahead and water it again. But we want to water deeply and infrequently. Shallow irrigation will tend to encourage a tree to develop shallow roots, because roots are going to grow where there's water. So we want to water them deeply and infrequently. Okay. And then for a mature tree, we're looking at about the same depth. 12 to 24 inches is where 90% of a tree's water absorbing roots are located. If that area of soil has gotten dry, then your tree is going to be struggling to pull up water. Just because a tree is tall and it may have some deep anchoring roots doesn't mean that those deep anchoring roots do much as far as pulling up water and moisture. So make sure we keep our trees well watered this fall to help them recover from the last 2 years of very dry conditions that we have. And fall watering can continue even into early December, because typically the soil has not frozen until sometime in January for us in the last few years. So keep those trees well watered, and it will hopefully help your trees come out strong next year, be good and vigorous, and look nice and healthy. All right. Our last few minutes here, I wanted to talk just a little bit about composting, because this is another great thing to think about in the fall. It won't be long now, and we will have lots and lots of trees coming up, or leaves coming off the trees. And so building a compost pile is a really great way to make use of all of that landscape waste. And as your vegetable garden is finishing up for the season, you'll have more landscape waste there that could go into a compost pile. So it's really good to think about having a compost pile if you don't have one already. Now, when we create a compost pile, we have to have a mix of materials. So we need some things that are what we call green materials, which are high in nitrogen but low in carbon. And then we have our brown materials, which are high in carbon and low in nitrogen. And we need them both, because the soil microbes that are going to start breaking down these organic materials need the green materials, the high nitrogen, for the proteins that they provide. And then they will use the high carbon materials to create energy for them to just live and reproduce and grow the way that they need to in our compost pile. So I've given you some examples here of some materials that we would consider green, which would be, pretty much any kind of manure, green vegetable waste, green grass clippings, coffee grounds, kitchen scraps. Those would all be considered greens. The browns would be things like dried tree leaves, corn stalks, hay, straw, pine needles, but even paper. You can shred paper and put that in a compost pile. You could even use sawdust and put that in a compost pile. So there's lots and lots of things that you could add to a compost pile. There are just a few that you want to avoid, though. So pig and pet manure We don't recommend that homeowners compost those things because there are some pathogens that we share with or that can affect pigs or pets that can also affect humans. And so if you were to create compost with this type of manure and then use that compost in a vegetable garden, maybe where you're growing some spinach or some greens, you could have problems with food safety in that situation. Meat scraps. Meat scraps can be composted, but we don't recommend them for the homeowner because they can attract wildlife. So you could end up encouraging raccoons or skunks or possums to come and start foraging in your compost pile, which generally most homeowners don't want. And the same for fat, oil, and dairy. They tend to disrupt the microbalance in a compost pile, and it can slow down the composting process. So we generally wouldn't want to add those items. Really heavily diseased plants. So if you had some tomato plants that were just completely covered with, with alternaria leaf spot or any of the other tomato diseases, it would be better to put those plant materials, either put them out with the trash for the municipal composting, or you could pit compost them, which means you could just dig a deep hole, and just bury them and let them break down in the soil. But a home composting pile may not get hot enough to kill all of those disease spores. And so then using the compost again, you could end up with more disease pressure than you wanted for your next crop. And the same is true for weeds like this pigweed flower, where you've got many, hundreds and thousands of seeds. It would be better not to compost this because you may not kill all of those seeds. And then you'll end up with problems. And then fungicide treated plants. So if you've treated your lawn with a fungicide for some type of a leaf disease this fall, it would be best if you didn't put those leaf clippings in your compost pile, because fungi, decomposing fungi, are one of the active components of a compost pile, one of our decomposers. And those fungicides can have an effect on the decomposing fungi too, which would disrupt your compost pile. Okay. So lots and lots of different structures that you can build to do composting in. This wooden compost bin is a nice, attractive one. But there are just so many different ways. You can create a composting bin with cinder blocks, cement blocks. There's lots of plans for them built of wood that you can make. But you can also compost with just a freestanding pile. You don't actually have to have a structure for compost to work well. So I wanted to give you a couple of examples here about how to get the carbon nitrogen ratio right so that your compost will break down actively. So in the first example, we've got two components. We've got tree leaves and grass clippings. So you can see the carbon nitrogen ratios of these two products. Tree leaves are 40 parts carbon, 1 part nitrogen. Grass clippings are 20 parts carbon and 1 part nitrogen. So if you add the 40, excuse me, add the 40 and the 20 together and then divide it by 2, because we had 2 components, you come up with the ideal ratio of 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And then in the second example, we have 3 different components here: corn stalks, grass clippings, and vegetable waste. And if we add those carbon ratios, we add 60, 20, and 20. That gives us 100 divided by 3, because we have 3 components, and we come up with about 33% carbon to 1 part nitrogen, which again is an ideal range for carbon and nitrogen. So another way that you can build a compost pile to try to get those ratios right is a layer method. And we have a good NEB guide available through Nebraska Extension on composting, and it discusses this layering method. And so with this method, what you do, you start with a layer that's about 4 to 6 inches thick of a high carbon material. Could be tree leaves, could be some kind of hay. Then on top of that, you add a 3 to 4 inch layer of something that's high nitrogen. like grass clippings or kitchen scraps or some kind of manure possibly. Then you add 1-inch layer of garden soil. Now your garden soil here is added as an inoculant because soil has all of those bacteria and fungi, microorganisms that are going to be your first decomposers that will be active in the pile. So you've got those 3 layers. You're going to mix them all together with a pitchfork. And as you're mixing, you're going to add water. Just hose it all down so that those materials are wet. You want them to be wet enough so that if you grabbed a handful of the mixture and squeezed it, you would get a drop or 2 of water coming out of the materials. So quite a bit of water. Again, the bacteria, which is one of our first decomposers, they need quite a bit of moisture to be present for them to be very active and do their job at decomposing. So 3 layers, you mix them together, you add water, and then you start again. You do on top of the pile, you do another layer of 4 to 6 inches of high carbon material, another layer of 3 to 4 inches of high nitrogen material, and then another inch of garden soil, and mix that all together. And you just keep going until you've either used up all of the materials that you wanted to compost, or you've reached the height of about 5 feet. If you go over about a 5 foot by 5 foot compost pile, you run the risk of having a lack of oxygen in the center of the pile, which will start anaerobic decomposition occurring. And anaerobic decomposition, or decomposition without the presence of a good level of oxygen, is when you start to get a bad smell. You'll start to get a sulfur or a rotten egg type smell. So we want to avoid anaerobic decomposition. And so we do that. One of the ways we do that is through how big of a pile we build.